So we've been listening to this for a while. Various politicians comparing ICE deportations in Minnesota to the German National Socialist Holocaust. One of the things that was outstanding in the field of stupidity, I guess, was Walz suggesting that at this very moment there was a immigrant child hiding in their attic, writing their diaries, just like Anne Frank did in Germany. And protester signs are just constantly just covered with nonstop references to this. And this is why it's a problem, and understand, when you're playing politics, hyperbole tends to work with a certain segment of the population. But this stuff is really, it's too much. To make the comparison dishonors Holocaust victims because this isn't one and the same at all. Holocaust victims were murdered in the millions, whereas people being deported, most fatalities are very limited, and essentially it's in process of resisting the law. Um, Making these just outrageous comparisons blinds people to actual things that could be fascistic, things that could be of the German National Socialist ilk. If you're constantly being told that there are mustachioed, swastika laden people hiding around every corner, and they're not, you're not going to recognize if it had actually happened. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about the differences between the German deportations of the 30s versus the current deportations going on currently in the United States. The first really comes down to citizenship. German Jewish families had been living in the various German states prior to the formation of Germany, and then thereafter, uh, in the neighborhood of, depending on whose figures, between 1,000 to 1,700 years. Uh, there were times in their past where their citizenship was in doubt, or they were essentially created as a second tier citizen, literally a second class citizen. But by the time modern Germany came along, Jews had been understood as citizens equal to any other citizens for hundreds of years. Whereas illegal aliens in America, either mere entry into the country, uh, violated the law. Now, this law that they're violating is something the Americans overwhelmingly voted for in the last election to have enforced. So it's a very different thing. Now, our current laws have been on the books for decades. This particular quote here, from Clinton: "We are a nation of immigrants, but we are also a nation of laws. It is wrong, and ultimately self-defeating for a nation of immigrants to permit this kind of abuse of our immigration laws we have seen in recent years, and we must do more to stop it." Now, what was going on in the 90s during immigration is, I mean, pale it's pale halcyon days compared to what was going on during the Biden administration, where there was just wholesale ignoring of the laws. So, and these laws were passed initially primarily by Democrats, because at that time the Democrats were protecting their union base, and at that time Republicans were favoring as much immigration as possible as uh, basically a handout to their wealthy class who wanted to employ a cheap labor force. So these laws have been on the books forever, and probably a lot of the laws we're seeing now were put in place in the 90s. However, enforcement has been always very erratic. Uh, Essentially, during the Clinton administration, there was a general lockdown in terms of immigration. George Bush opened it up a bit again. Obama started locking it down, then opened it up, and then Biden basically opened the floodgates. So the laws that haven't changed in 30, 40 years, it's just how people are enforcing them. Again, Americans voted to overwhelmingly have these laws enforced at this time. Now, when we go back and look at the German National Socialist movement, essentially, as they came into power, they passed a lot of new laws that were just suddenly there. Uh, and in many ways, these laws were passed extra legally. They weren't uh, in line with their constitution and system of laws, and essentially a lot of that was being tossed out the door. So essentially, to set up the legality of getting rid of their Jewish citizens, uh, basically was revolutionary in nature. Whereas our immigration enforcement of people who are not our citizens uh, has how we've been doing things by the book for decades. Now, in terms of when the National Socialists came to power in Germany, a lot of Germans didn't fully understand the scope of what the German socialists were going to do when they were elected. Um, Although a lot of people talk about what was written in Mein Kampf, a lot of people looked at it in the same way as we look at election promises going into an election, where it's like, okay, yeah, they make lots of promises, but they don't actually follow through. And so it wasn't like the Germans were specifically asking for this. Some were, yes. However, a lot of them were looking for uh, socialism and a change to the current system because the Weimar Republic was failing. One of the things to remember is even though, uh, see, in terms of German Jews were pretty much, again, since they'd been there for hundreds of years, thousands of years, or over a thousand in some cases, being legal citizens, they were not just merely legal citizens, they were upstanding citizens. They were key contributors to the economy. They didn't break the law, they were overwhelmingly law abiding people. By definition, our illegal aliens have broken the law. You can't enter the country without breaking the law. If you don't like the law, convince your party to change it. That's been the law for over 40 years. 40% of the current deportees that have been going on over the last year or so have broken criminal laws beyond just entering the country illegally. Um, Now, when we talk about the German Jews, because they had lived there for so long, for generations upon generations, they literally had no other place to go. They didn't have relatives in foreign lands to go to. Uh, they didn't have a common language in other countries. Most of them spoke German or, in some cases, Yiddish, which most Germans could understand because it's basically a amalgamated form of Hebrew and German. So most Germans could hear Yiddish and understand what was being said. Whereas at that time, there wasn't a place where German speaking or Yiddish speaking people could go to and be amongst people they were speaking to, or speaking to people who would understand them. Whereas almost all illegal aliens are being sent to their homes. And in many cases, there's family there. At the very least, it's culture they recognize, it's language that they understand. Now, there have been a few aberrations because of the way our laws have been being enforced. There are occasions where there's people who are here illegally and somehow are not uh, have no cultural or language ties to the country they would be sent back to. Um, that's really a function of how stupidly we're enforcing the laws, not as much a problem with how the deportations are working now. Um, they're aberrations, and that's why they like pointing them out when they happen, because they're really the exception to the norm. When the Germans attempted to do their initial deportations, essentially, most countries refused to accept Jewish Germans. Uh, what's depicted here is the SS St. Louis, also known as the Ship of the Damned, turned basically full of Jews fleeing Germany, and it was turned away pretty much at every port it went into, including the United States of America. Uh, some Jews did escape Germany into the rest of Europe, but a lot of them ended up in countries that were soon to be overrun by the National Socialists. And ultimately, when Poland was conquered, that was used as the gateway to deport Jews out of the proper German Reich. And again, legal aliens uh, are essentially being accepted by their country of origin. They're going back to their families, their communities, a shared language, going there by permission of their own government. So, why are deportations happening? Well, in terms of illegal aliens in America, uh, there is a perception that this is inflicting economic hardship on Americans due to the long term assimilation costs that are involved. Now, I've talked about this in other videos. Essentially, if you look at Cato, which is basically 100% all for as much immigration that can possibly happen. I'm not sure if they're actually open borders, but they're very close to it. Cato, so they're the ones who are basically saying, yep, we can bring them all here. They acknowledge that it takes an immigrant family, basically, they're a negative impact on the economy until their children reach working age. So if you do the math, it means at a certain level, uh, immigration has a negative impact on the country. Basically, if you have a small amount of immigration, it's a small drag on the economy where essentially it's setting back the standard of living of Americans. However, if you do a huge wave of immigration, it's probably dragging us back significantly. And there very well may be impacts to the economy that occurred during the Biden administration, in addition to all the other things that happened. Uh, Mass immigration may have impacted our economy negatively and may still be, uh, we may still be digging out from that. The thing that I always find oddest of all is that the primary beneficiaries of mass immigration is big American companies and businesses. Essentially, these companies get cheap labor. Okay. And so, how is that cheap labor take? How do they? What's the offset? Well, essentially, this cheap labor needs to be supported. Uh, this cheap labor goes to our emergency rooms. They go to our schools. They haven't helped build the schools. They just showed up at them. Uh, and a lot of them receive some form of government assistance along the way. So the thing is so in order for big business to get lots of cheap labor, the American taxpayer offsets this cheap labor so that they can function in this country. How the left has embraced this as beneficial is beyond me. It doesn't make any sense. Um, I mean, I even though I grew up in a union family, I'm very far removed from those politics. The Democrats made a lot more sense when they were essentially backing their union base, whereas now they're essentially creating a welfare program to provide cheap labor to big business so that uh, Americans are crowded out because we won't work at the wages these guys are working at. It doesn't make any sense. So, why were the Germans getting rid of the Jews? Now, this is one of the things people get very confused about because um, although there's a very strong racist element to it, it's not racism alone that drives the idea of the deportations. Um, the form of German socialism that was in place, uh, basically, it was originally birthed out of Marxism. And when Marxism failed to meet most of the goals and milestones that Marx had predicted, many different splinter groups of socialism went their own ways. Whereas Marxism originally believed that the reason why society didn't function right was because of conflict between the classes. Whereas German National Socialism decided that it wasn't conflict between the classes that was the problem, it was conflict between the races. And primarily, they saw this conflict between the races as um, the Nordic Aryan group on one side and the Jews on the other. And the only way they believed their socialist system could work is if Jews weren't part of it. And initially, it seemed that their sole goal was to deport. We've uh, Mein Kampf even talked about opening up Madagascar as some mass settlement. Uh, it went the very dark route it did because as Germany was collapsing when they started losing the war, because their belief system said that the Jews were the problem, they believed they needed to accelerate their efforts in order to increase the likelihood that they might be able to somehow pull out of it all. So, in a nutshell, the Germans believed that their system could never be complete as long as Jews existed inside of it. All right, so that's covering deportations. I'm thinking I'm going to probably get into a little bit more of the idea of trying to debunk the insanity that people are having right now about basically seeing Nazis hiding around every corner. Anyways, comment section below. Is there something I didn't cover here that you think I missed? Feel free to mention it. I'll possibly talk about it in the comments or possibly bring it up in another video. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, look at my titles. You'll see I get into a lot of different things worth subscribing. Please subscribe. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.